At 9:02 in the morning, Donald Trump signed an executive order that his advisors had assured him would bring Canada to its knees within 72 hours. By 11:47 that same morning, Mark Carney had already responded, not with a press release, not with a diplomatic cable, not with a phone call through back channels, but with a coordinated sequence of economic countermeasures so precisely constructed, so immediately damaging to American interests, and so thoroughly prepared in advance that senior officials in Washington spent the remainder of the day asking a question that nobody inside the building could answer with confidence. How did they do that in under 3 hours? The answer to that question is the story of trade, war, day zero. And once you understand what actually transpired on that morning, you will never view the Canada-US relationship or American trade strategy in quite the same way again. This is not a story about tariff rates. It is a story about preparation against improvisation, about a superpower that confused its own scale with strategy, and a mid-sized nation that had spent 18 months quietly, methodically, and almost invisibly constructing the complete architecture of its response before the executive order was ever drafted. Trump's team had assumed the shock of the morning's action would paralyze Ottawa. What they did not know, what no one in the administration appears to have been told or chosen to investigate, is that Canada had wargamed this exact scenario down to the hour. The 9:02 a.m. order did not catch Canada unprepared. It triggered a plan that was already fully loaded, already calibrated, and already waiting for precisely this moment to arrive. The details of what unfolded between 9:02 a.m. and 11:47 a.m. on that morning are more consequential for North American economic history than anything that has occurred since NAFTA was signed. So let us go through it, minute by minute, decision by decision, because the timeline is the argument. The executive order Trump signed at 9:02 a.m. carried the internal White House designation, the North American Economic Sovereignty and Reciprocal Trade Act, though it was released publicly simply as an executive trade action. It imposed a blanket 35% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States, with a specific 52% surcharge applied to Canadian steel and aluminum. It included a full suspension of the joint energy framework that had governed cross-border electricity and petroleum flows for the preceding 11 years. And it embedded within Section 7, Paragraph 4 of its supplementary language, a demand that Canada renegotiate the entire structure of its dairy and softwood lumber protections within 90 days, or face an additional escalating tariff tier. The White House communications apparatus had a full media rollout prepared. Talking points distributed to cabinet members and congressional allies framed the action as a long overdue correction of structural imbalances that Canadian trade policy had been exploiting for decades. The framing was deliberate and carefully constructed: Canada as the aggressor, America as the nation finally acting in its own defense. The Commerce Secretary gave 3 separate morning television interviews before 10 a.m., each one characterizing the order as a necessary realignment that Canada would ultimately come to recognize as equitable. In 2 of those interviews, he was asked directly whether Canada had been given advance notice. His answer, delivered with practiced confidence, was that Canada's trade representatives had been informed through appropriate channels. The response was technically accurate in the narrowest possible construction. Canada had been told a trade action was coming. What the Secretary did not say, because in all likelihood he genuinely did not know, was what Canada had done with that information in the weeks and months preceding 9:02 a.m. 18 months before the executive order was signed, Canadian intelligence and trade analysts had produced a classified internal assessment. The document, which does not officially exist on any public record, but whose contents have been confirmed by 3 separate sources with direct knowledge, was titled Scenario Delta. It modeled precisely this situation: a blanket American tariff exceeding 30%, a simultaneous suspension of the energy framework, and a coordinated demand for dairy and lumber renegotiation. It modeled the downstream economic impact on each affected Canadian industry sector. It modeled the political timeline inside Washington. It mapped the likely communications framing the White House apparatus would deploy. And it outlined in granular operational detail a response framework specifically calibrated to deliver maximum economic counterpressure on the United States within a 4-hour window of any such order being executed. The 4-hour target was not chosen arbitrarily. Canadian trade analysts had calculated, based on American market opening times, established media cycle patterns, and the logistics of international financial communication, that a response arriving within 4 hours of an American trade action would land before American business markets had fully absorbed the implications of the initial order, before the White House communications team had completed its rollout narrative, before allied governments had issued their first round of formal diplomatic statements. A response within 4 hours would not register as reactive. It would be reported as simultaneous, as though Canada had not answered America's move, but had moved at precisely the same moment on the same morning, as equals initiating parallel actions rather than a smaller nation scrambling in the wake of a superpower's decision. Canada's response arrived at 11:47 a.m., 2 hours and 45 minutes after the order was signed, 15 minutes ahead of their own internal 4-hour target. When Mark Carney walked to the podium in Ottawa at 11:47 a.m., the majority of American media assumed they were about to observe the standard diplomatic playbook. Formal objection, reference to existing trade agreement language, announcement of consultations, perhaps a preliminary counter-tariff on a symbolic category of American goods. The measured, proportionate kind of response that a smaller trading partner typically delivers when a larger one has moved against it. What Carney announced was none of those things. It was not measured, it was not symbolic, and it was not preliminary. The first element was a complete and immediate suspension of Canadian uranium exports to the United States. Canada is the world's second largest uranium producer. The United States sources approximately 28% of its nuclear fuel supply from Canadian operations, fuel that powers 93 American nuclear reactors, providing electricity to approximately 28 million American households. The suspension was effective immediately, with a 48-hour formal notice period as required under existing bilateral agreement terms. The 48-hour clock had already begun before Carney reached the podium. His team had filed the suspension notice at 10:53 a.m., while the Commerce Secretary was still completing his third morning television interview. The second element was the activation of what Canada internally designated the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol, a framework through which Canada would immediately redirect export licensing for 14 categories of critical minerals away from American purchasers and toward pre-approved alternative buyers in the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The minerals affected included cobalt, of which Canada supplies 38% of American industrial consumption, thallium, used in American solar panel manufacturing, and indium, a component in approximately 60% of American flat panel display production. The reorientation was not a tariff. It was not a negotiating position. It was a physical redirection of existing supply chains executed through export licensing modifications that took legal effect the moment Carney finished speaking. The third element was the announcement of binding agreements, signed that same morning before 9 a.m., with 7 European and 3 Pacific nations, committing Canadian agricultural exports to new long-term supply arrangements at fixed prices. This was the element that produced the most visible reaction inside the White House, because it meant that the dairy and softwood lumber renegotiation demand embedded in Section 7 of Trump's executive order had already been rendered functionally obsolete before the ink on the order had fully dried. The customers Trump had assumed Canada would come to him to access had already been replaced. Not threatened with replacement, not proposed for replacement. Replaced with signed contracts, Before 9 a.m., that last detail, the agricultural agreements executed before 9 a.m., on the same morning Trump signed his executive order, is the element that remains incompletely reported and whose full implications have not been absorbed in Washington. Canada did not sign those agreements in response to the executive order. Canada signed them in anticipation of it, which means that in the weeks and months preceding Trade War Day Zero, Canadian trade officials had not merely predicted that this morning would arrive, they had used its inevitability as a deadline, a forcing function to get agricultural trade partners to commit to terms, because Canada could approach those partners and say with complete accuracy that an American trade rupture was imminent, and that partners who moved early would secure better conditions than those who waited to observe how events unfolded. The threat of American pressure had been converted by Canada into a negotiating instrument with third-party nations, used to construct the replacement framework before the pressure itself arrived. As one European trade analyst described it when the timeline became fully clear, it represents one of the most sophisticated applications of anticipatory economic diplomacy in the post-war period. Canada had taken the inevitability of American aggression and transformed it into leverage with everyone except America itself. The Canadian team that executed this strategy spent 3 hours on the morning of Trade War Day Zero confirming, finalizing, and preparing to announce a response that had taken 18 months to construct. Trump's team spent those same 3 hours conducting media interviews explaining why Canada would have no available option but to comply. The 11:47 a.m. response reached the White House at approximately 11:52 a.m., when the first wire service alert moved across the screens in the Situation Room. According to 3 officials with knowledge of what transpired in that building that morning, the initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. The uranium suspension was the first element processed, and the immediate question from senior staff was whether Canada possessed the legal authority to execute such a suspension under the terms of existing bilateral agreements. The answer came back from the legal team within 19 minutes. Yes, under the terms of the existing energy framework, whose suspension had been included in Trump's 9:02 a.m. executive order, Canada retained full discretionary authority over export licensing for all strategic materials. By suspending the energy framework, the executive order had simultaneously removed the primary legal constraint on Canadian export redirection. The White House had, in effect, handed Canada the precise legal instrument required to execute the Critical Minerals Reorientation Protocol in full, by eliminating the treaty structure that would otherwise have complicated it. A senior NSC official described the following 20 minutes in the Situation Room as the most uncomfortable shift in room temperature he had ever experienced across his years in government. The legal team's answer was what made the complete picture visible. The administration had spent 18 months escalating pressure on Canada. Canada had spent those same 18 months using that pressure to build its response. And then on the morning the pressure was supposed to reach its decisive conclusion, the executive order had inadvertently removed the last remaining legal obstacle to that response being executed in its entirety. The economic impact projections arrived on Situation Room screens at approximately 1:30 p.m. The uranium suspension alone was projected to cost American energy producers between $4.2 billion and $6.8 billion in the first year through alternative sourcing costs, with a projected 14-month delay before alternative supply chains could be fully established. The critical minerals reorientation was projected to disrupt American manufacturing supply chains across solar production, display technology, and defense electronics, with a first-year impact estimated at $11.3 billion. The agricultural trade agreements meant that the 90-day renegotiation clock embedded in Section 7 of the executive order was now running against a Canadian government that had, that same morning, reduced its structural dependence on American agricultural markets by approximately 34%. By 2 p.m., the response Canada had delivered in under 3 hours was already projected to cost American interests more in year one than Trump's tariffs were projected to generate in revenue across the same period. The administration had not broken Canada, it had activated Canada's prepared response, and the response was winning. At 11:47 a.m., Carney was composed in a manner that, viewed in retrospect, communicates everything about the nature of what Canada had constructed and how long it had been building it. He did not raise his voice. He displayed no visible anger. He did not reach for the rhetorical escalation that a leader who had been genuinely surprised and was improvising under pressure would naturally default to. He spoke the way a person speaks when they are reading from a plan they have complete confidence in, because he was. The most consequential thing Carney said at that podium was also the briefest. After announcing the 3 primary countermeasures, he paused, looked directly into the cameras, and said, "Canada has been preparing for this morning for some time. We are ready to continue. We are also ready to stop. The decision about which of those 2 things happens next belongs to Washington, not to Ottawa." 14 words in that final sentence that inverted the entire power dynamic of the morning. Trump's executive order had been designed to place Canada in a position of supplication, to force Ottawa to come to Washington requesting relief. Carney's response had placed the decision about what happened next squarely in Washington's hands, not as a concession, but as a burden. If the confrontation continued, it would continue, because Washington chose to continue it. The costs of that continuation would be borne by American consumers, American manufacturers, and American energy users. The choice belonged to America. So did the consequences. He then walked away from the podium without taking questions. The entire press conference had lasted 11 minutes. The sophistication of what Canada executed on Trade War Day Zero did not emerge from that morning. It emerged from a decision made 18 months earlier, at a moment when most analysts were still characterizing the early trade tensions as posturing rather than sustained policy. The Carney government had made a foundational strategic judgment that American escalation was not episodic but structural, that the administration's approach to Canada was not a negotiating tactic with a built-in resolution, but a political orientation that would continue escalating until it encountered resistance capable of imposing genuine costs. From that judgment, Ottawa made a second decision, that the most effective response to sustained escalating pressure was not counter-escalation in kind, which would feed the administration's preferred narrative of mutual aggression, but the patient, invisible construction of alternatives that would make Canadian economic dependence on American markets structurally smaller before the confrontation reached its peak. Every signed contract, every redirected supply chain, every third-party agricultural agreement that preceded the 9:02 a.m. executive order represented one component of that architecture. Individually, each element was unremarkable, the ordinary daily business of trade diplomacy. Collectively executed across 18 months and activated simultaneously on a single morning, they constituted something categorically different. A country that had been told it was structurally dependent on America had spent 18 months becoming measurably less dependent, quietly, without announcement, without provocation. One contract, one licensing agreement, and one bilateral framework at a time. By the time Trump signed the order at 9:02 a.m., Canada had already spent 18 months building the exit. The order was the door. Canada had already found its way around it. The White House projection shared in internal briefings before the order was signed anticipated a 72-hour compliance window. The theory was that the combined shock of the blanket tariff, the energy framework suspension, and the dairy and lumber ultimatum would generate sufficient economic pressure on Canadian industries to force Carney to the negotiating table within 3 days, in a sufficiently weakened position to accept terms Washington had already prepared. Those terms, a 22-page framework document developed jointly by the Commerce Department and the Office of the United States Trade Representative, were sitting in a folder on the Commerce Secretary's desk at 9:02 a.m. They had been prepared in advance because the White House fully expected the 72-hour window to produce a Canadian government arriving in Washington, asking what America required to lift the tariffs. By 72 hours after the order was signed, the uranium suspension had moved from announcement to operational reality, with American nuclear plant operators formally notifying the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that alternative sourcing timelines were being initiated. The critical minerals reorientation had completed its first wave of export license transfers. 3 of the 7 new European agricultural agreements had produced their first physical shipments. The Canadian dollar, which the White House had projected would fall between 4 and 6% in the 72-hour window, had declined 1.1% before stabilizing as international markets processed the scope and credibility of Canada's countermeasures. The 22-page framework document on the Commerce Secretary's desk had not been transmitted to Ottawa, because Ottawa had not requested it, because Ottawa had not arrived at the table seeking relief. The 72-hour projection had been built on a model of Canadian economic vulnerability that 18 months of invisible architectural work had already made obsolete. Washington had been planning its response to a Canada that no longer existed. Trade War Day Zero is significant not because of the tariff rates, not because of the countermeasures, and not even because of the remarkable timeline, though the timeline is genuinely without precedent. It is significant because of what it revealed about the fundamental character of the conflict that produced it. The American strategy had been premised on an assumed asymmetry, a superpower and a smaller neighbor, a nation with $28 trillion in GDP and a nation with $2.1 trillion. The assumption embedded in every escalation, every ultimatum, and every executive order was that the asymmetry of scale was itself decisive. That Canada could not afford sustained resistance because the cost of resistance would become unbearable, and that once Canada reached that understanding, compliance would naturally follow. What Trade War Day Zero demonstrated is that asymmetry of scale is categorically not the same as asymmetry of preparation. A smaller country that has spent 18 months constructing alternatives, redirecting supply chains, executing contracts, and developing operational contingency frameworks can impose disproportionate costs on a larger country that spent those same 18 months assuming its scale made preparation unnecessary. Canada did not match American power on the morning of Trade War Day Zero. Canada made American power expensive. And making power expensive is, across the entire history of international economic conflict, among the most consistently effective strategies a smaller nation can deploy against a larger one. The 22-page framework document is still on the Commerce Secretary's desk. Carney is still in Ottawa. The uranium supply clock is still running. The mineral supply chains remain redirected. The agricultural contracts remain in force and producing shipments. Trump signed the order at 9:02 a.m. Canada's response arrived before noon. And the morning that was designed to end in Canadian compliance is now the morning being studied in trade ministries from Brussels to Tokyo as the definitive modern model for how a fully prepared nation absorbs a superpower's pressure and methodically converts it into durable leverage. The order is signed, the response is filed, the costs are compounding by the day, and somewhere inside a Commerce Department office in Washington, a 22-page document that was supposed to have been delivered to Ottawa 72 hours after 9:02 a.m. is still sitting in its folder, waiting for a request that never came. Ottawa never asked for it.